Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky arrived in Paris carrying a mixture of urgency, political pressure, and the weight of a nation still locked in the most consequential European war of the 21st century. His visit to meet French President Emmanuel Macron came at a moment when the battlefield situation is shifting, Western support is under strain, and diplomatic maneuvers are suddenly accelerating on multiple fronts. Yet what made this particular meeting different from his previous European tours was not only the intensifying challenges inside Ukraine, but the timing. Less than 24 hours before Russian President Vladimir Putin was scheduled to receive an envoy personally dispatched by US President Donald Trump. The sequence was striking. Kyiv's leader meeting France's president in Paris, just as Moscow prepared to host a representative of Trump, an envoy widely believed to be carrying or refining the contours of a proposed US plan to end the war. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. Paris, Moscow, and Washington, three capitals that have shaped European history, were suddenly orbiting around a diplomatic moment that could influence the trajectory of the conflict. And Zelensky, whose political fate is tied to the survival of Ukraine as a sovereign state, arrived in Paris fully aware that the geopolitical landscape was shifting beneath his feet. The war had entered a phase where military dynamics, domestic politics in Western capitals, and high-level diplomacy were converging in ways that could either strengthen Kyiv's hand or corner it into hard choices. As Zelensky's convoy moved through the tree-lined avenues of the French capital, cameras captured a leader who looked more determined than triumphant. Ukraine's battlefield losses, ammunition shortages, and the slow creep of war fatigue in the West had all been well documented. But there was something else, a sense that decisions taken in the coming weeks might dramatically alter Ukraine's strategic position. For Zelensky, Paris was not just another diplomatic checkpoint. It was an essential opportunity to secure guarantees, extract commitments, and align with a European partner that had repeatedly advocated for a just and lasting peace, while also encouraging negotiations that did not leave Ukraine exposed. Inside the Élysée Palace, Macron greeted Zelensky with words crafted both for reassurance and for diplomatic positioning. France has played a complex role throughout the war, staunchly supportive of Kyiv, yet increasingly vocal about the need to consider long-term European security architecture and the conditions that would lead to negotiations. Macron's previous comments about European troops, missile deliveries, and the need for Europe to show strategic boldness had sparked reactions across the continent. For Zelensky, these remarks were both an opportunity and a warning. France was committed, but France also wanted influence in whatever diplomatic endgame eventually emerged. The two leaders sat down in a private meeting that lasted far longer than initially planned. According to officials familiar with the discussion, Zelensky pressed Macron to accelerate France's next military aid package, including artillery shells, air defense systems, and long-range capabilities that could deter continued Russian advances. Macron, for his part, emphasized Europe's commitment, but also raised concerns about escalation, alliance unity, and the need to consider diplomatic channels, especially as American policy appeared to be shifting. That shift was the shadow hovering over the room, the upcoming meeting in Moscow between Vladimir Putin and Trump's envoy. The identity of the envoy, part diplomat, part business figure, part political bridge, had fueled speculation across European capitals. Some believed he was sent merely to listen, to gauge Russian red lines. Others suspected he was carrying talking points related to Trump's 28-point framework, a plan that had been circulating behind closed doors in Washington, Kyiv, and several European capitals. Zelensky was well aware of the chatter, a US administration exploring a dramatic recalibration of its Ukraine policy would have profound consequences for Kyiv. If Washington were now more inclined toward a negotiated settlement, one that could freeze the conflict along current lines or force compromises, Ukraine would need its European allies to push back or at least demand terms that safeguarded Ukrainian sovereignty. And Zelensky, who has repeatedly warned that freezing the conflict would simply embolden Moscow, arrived in Paris to ensure that Europe would not drift into accepting an outcome crafted without Kyiv's full consent. Macron listened, taking notes, often leaning forward. France, he assured Zelensky, would continue to support Ukrainian defence and would not accept any settlement imposed by force. But he also made clear that diplomacy, including back-channel discussions involving Washington, Moscow and other players, was part of the reality. The challenge was to prevent diplomacy from becoming a pressure campaign aimed primarily at Ukraine. Peace, Macron was said to emphasise, cannot reward aggression. It was a line that reflected both principle and strategic caution. Outside the palace, analysts watched the meeting with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Europe finds itself caught between supporting Ukraine militarily and preparing for a geopolitical environment increasingly shaped by American political shifts. Trump's upcoming diplomatic engagement, whether exploratory or substantive, was seen in many capitals as a potential pivot point. Some hoped it could pressure Moscow into serious negotiations. Others feared it could lock in Russian territorial gains. For Ukraine, the uncertainty was as dangerous as any battlefield development. As the meeting in Paris continued, Zelensky's team remained in constant communication with Kyiv, where military commanders were reporting intensified Russian pressure along several fronts. Russian drones and missiles continued to target Ukraine's energy infrastructure, aiming to weaken the country during winter months. Ukrainian forces, exhausted and stretched thin, had been forced to adapt to a more defensive posture. Zelensky used the Paris visit to highlight these realities, reminding Macron that without sustained and increased support, Ukraine's ability to resist would be undermined and that any negotiation would take place under far less favourable conditions. What made the Paris meeting particularly sensitive was that Zelensky knew he had to walk a tightrope. On one side, he needed to show openness to diplomacy. On the other, he could not appear desperate or willing to concede substantial territory. Macron understood this political balancing act and sought to publicly emphasise unity while privately discussing the possible contours of an eventual diplomatic settlement. Among the issues raised were future security guarantees, the role of NATO, reconstruction financing, and what terms might be acceptable or unacceptable to Ukraine. Both leaders shared the view that European security cannot be rebuilt by legitimising aggression. But the subtext known to everyone in the room was that the world might soon face a peace plan shaped not by European consensus, but by an evolving US strategy aimed at ending the war before it drags into another election cycle or destabilises other priorities. As Zelensky stepped out of the Élysée palace after the meeting, journalists shouted questions about the upcoming Putin-Trump envoy talks. He avoided direct speculation, saying only that Ukraine welcomes any effort aimed at achieving a fair peace, but will not accept solutions that compromise its territorial integrity. The remark was measured, but it conveyed the deeper message. Kyiv was aware that diplomatic storms were gathering and that Ukraine needed every ally it could get. Meanwhile, in Moscow, preparations were underway for Putin's reception of the Trump envoy. Russian state media framed the upcoming meeting as a sign that Washington was reconsidering its failed Ukraine strategy. Kremlin officials hinted that Russia was ready to discuss peace, but only from a position of strength and only under conditions that recognized what they called new realities on the ground. These realities, of course, referred to the territories seized by Russia since the invasion began. The contrast between Paris and Moscow could not have been sharper. In Paris, the atmosphere was one of urgency mixed with cooperation, a Western ally striving to maintain pressure on Russia while weighing the emerging diplomatic landscape. In Moscow, the mood was more confident, even triumphant. Russian forces had made incremental gains. Western unity showed signs of strain, and the Kremlin believed that time was on its side. The arrival of Trump's envoy was seen not as a concession from Moscow, but as a potential validation of its strategic patience. For European leaders, the concern was that US diplomacy might run ahead of European interests. If Washington sought to quickly end the war, perhaps through a ceasefire or territorial freeze, Europe would face long-term security risks. Macron, who has increasingly positioned himself as a guardian of European strategic autonomy, wanted to ensure that France and the EU remained central to any future negotiation. That was one reason why Zelensky's Paris visit was so critical. It allowed France and Ukraine to coordinate ahead of Washington-Moscow contacts that could reshape the conflict's trajectory. Inside Ukraine, the political stakes were equally high. Zelensky has faced rising domestic criticism over the handling of the war, conscription reforms, and corruption scandals in civilian institutions. His political legitimacy remains strong, but the pressure has grown. If diplomatic deals begin to take shape without Ukraine at the centre, Zelensky could face both internal backlash and external vulnerability. The Paris meeting signalled that he was not passively watching global powers manoeuvre around him. He was actively shaping the environment, seeking allies, and pushing for terms that preserved Ukraine's long-term security. As the day in Paris progressed, Zelensky and Macron held a joint press appearance projecting unity. They spoke about defence cooperation, humanitarian aid, and the need for continued international pressure on Russia. Macron reiterated France's support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, emphasising that any peace must be on Ukraine's terms. Yet behind the diplomatic phrasing, both leaders knew that the coming weeks would test their resolve. Diplomacy was accelerating perhaps faster than Ukraine was comfortable with. The broader strategic environment added another layer of complexity. China was quietly observing developments, positioning itself as a potential mediator while maintaining deep energy and trade relations with Russia. European countries were debating whether to increase their defence spending further. The US Congress remained divided on Ukraine aid, and Trump's personal approach to foreign policy, marked by unpredictable moves and transactional thinking, introduced additional uncertainty. Against this backdrop, Zelensky's Paris visit was not merely a bilateral meeting. It was part of a global chessboard where major powers were recalculating their next moves. The voiceover of this documentary captures the essence of that moment. A Ukrainian president seeking to secure his nation's future, a French president trying to safeguard European interests, a Russian president preparing to shape the next phase of the war through diplomacy and force, and an American president's envoy stepping into the conflict with the potential to redefine the entire geopolitical equation. This convergence of actors, cities, and agendas created a rare moment, one where diplomacy, war, politics, and power all intersected. As night settled over Paris, Zelensky remained in talks with his advisors, reviewing military updates and preparing for the next stage of his European engagement. The following day, all eyes would turn to Moscow, where Putin would receive Trump's envoy in a meeting that carried geopolitical implications far beyond its immediate agenda. Whatever emerged from that encounter, whether a gesture, a proposal, or a strategic signal, would feed back into Kyiv's calculations and Paris's diplomatic positioning. Europe, after years of conflict, had entered a new phase one where military realities and diplomatic possibilities were merging. Zelensky understood that this moment demanded clarity, unity, and strategic foresight. His visit to Paris was an attempt to shape those forces, to ensure that Ukraine's voice remained central as the world's major powers began contemplating how this war might eventually end. For now, the war continues. But in Paris and Moscow, decisions were being shaped that could determine the direction of the next chapter, either toward a peace that preserves Ukraine's sovereignty or toward a precarious freeze that leaves Europe facing a fragile and uncertain future. In these diplomatic corridors, where gestures carry weight and timing carries meaning, Zelensky's visit to Paris was not simply a meeting. It was an urgent bid to secure his nation's future before others decide it for him.
Okay, thank you.